So we wanted to get started by maybe just sharing a little bit about who we are and some brief introductions before we begin our dialogue and conversation. Pedro, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm Pedro Santiago, one of the co-authors. I came to this book because of the different activism and relationships, friendships that we've had with Steve and like you, Mariela, and really everybody who is participating in writing this book.
Steve?
Yeah, my name is Steve Pavey, and I live in Lexington, Kentucky, now just a few blocks from Pedro.
Yeah.
We've known each other for a long time, for over a decade. And I met Mariela at a applied anthropology conference, I think, first, maybe not before that, but I am an anthropologist and an activist and organizer, now doing a lot with the Poor People's Campaign.
And I'm Mariela Nuñez-Janes, also known in some circles as Profe. I'm also an anthropologist, just like Steve and also like Pedro. Pedro, you got your BA in anthropology, right?
Yes.
So we're all anthropologists, but we have followed some different paths. And so I'm currently a professor at a public university in Texas. And I realized that this is kind of a reunion for us because we have seen each other in print, but have not seen each other in person or in at least virtually for some time. So I'm glad that we have this opportunity to be together. So to start our conversation, we thought we reflect with you on the title of our book. And we think our book is unique in part because of its authorship. And so we wanted to write collectively, and we did so. And our authorship is a collective voice. And so in the list of authors, you will see our names listed in alphabetical order. And that was kind of a way to our compromise, right? To be able to acknowledge our individual voice, but also in this collective way. And so to do that reflection, we wanted to share also some excerpts of our prelude so that you can get a sense of our voice and also as to some of the reasons why our book is named the way that it is. Pedro, you want to get us started from really reading from the prelude?
Yeah, so this is from page 1 from the prelude. Some things can only be learned in the darkness. We had already come to realize this somewhere deep within our bodies, from sharing our stories and listening to those of so many other courageous youth coming out of the shadows, declaring, I am undocumented and unafraid. What we had come to know as true, we learned by navigating the contradictions lived deep within our experiences of illegality, inequality, and the everyday threat of deportability. Our common struggle for human freedom, and at times simply for survival, led to that moment in 2010, with optimism, hard work, and determination. That moment where belonging, civil rights, upward mobility, and a path to citizenship seemed possible. This was our dream.
And then we skip ahead quite a few pages through some narrative describing the work that we were doing together across the country with many, many others in the effort to fight for the DREAM Act that finally failed to pass on December 18th, 2010. And our narrative continues. It was so close. There was a visible numbness among us, a shock that immediately gave way to tears and a strong embrace across the gallery. What now? Now that we'd witnessed this eclipse of dreams. In other places and times, an eclipse warned of imminent danger and disaster, maybe even the end of the world. The failure of the DREAM Act felt like this, yet in the darkness of this moment, it did not take long to see a glimpse of light. Maybe, just maybe, this eclipse was a warning to us. What if our dreams, the very scope of our horizons, what we hope for ourselves and others, was limited by the framework in which we express them, this American dream itself?
What if, out of our real pain and desire for freedom, we had become pawns in a system where freedom is an illusion? Did we lose track of our ends and compromise our means because of this dream framework? What if united we dream and the political economic power behind those that claim to represent us under a united dream were never united and confused dreams with lies? What if, from the outset, our framing of the issue, our struggle for freedom, was itself problematic? In the darkness, we began to realize that the search for a solution to the immigration problem, when mirrored in the rationale of the American dream, was part of the problem.
As we asked ourselves these questions and contemplated the end of our world, the end of the dream, we began to follow the light that we had found in our lives and the love within our community and shared struggle for freedom. We began to understand the lives and choices of our parents as filled with dignity and courage. Instead of blaming them, we praised them for their faith to risk everything for their children. And now that darkness eclipsed our personal dreams, we saw the absurdity of what maybe Du Bois described as the strong man or the dreamer, fighting to be free in order that another people should not be free. We were beginning to see that the dream for collective freedom and the dignity for all humanity was not only a greater dream, but one in conflict with the American dream.
What passes in Eclipse was possibly a reminder that what was lost, that it had been won, might have truly destroyed us. We might have won our access to the American dream at the expense of the greater struggle for our freedom. Uncle Vincent Harding would later tell us that it was lazy journalists and historians who had framed what was a Black-led struggle for freedom as a civil rights movement, attempting to squeeze something vast into a legislative straitjacket. Similarly, Michelle Alexander challenged us to consider what was lost when we celebrated the granting of certain civil rights by embracing a politics of respectability.
We were reminded of what we were learning in the dark when President Barack Obama spoke to the nation just a month after the DREAM Act's defeat, saying, "Today, there are hundreds of thousands of students excelling in our schools who are not American citizens. Some are the children of undocumented workers who had nothing to do with the actions of their parents. As soon as they obtain advanced degrees, we send them back to home to compete against us. It makes no sense. Let's stop expelling talented, responsible young people who could be staffing our research labs or starting a new business, who could be further enriching this nation."
For the strong man, the perfect dreamer, to gain rights meant that the bad dreamer was deportable, and further that the illegal dreams of the perfect dreamer's parents were worthless. We began to see that the criteria for the DREAM Act reinscribed and reinforced race and class barriers to inclusion in this society. The DREAM Act would bar the rest of the undocumented community from becoming free. The American dream came with great cost.
We continue to search for light and discover hope in the darkness. James Baldwin may best describe what we learned. Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one an identity, the end of safety. Yet it is only when a person is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a dream he has long cherished or a privilege he has long possessed that he is set free. Then he has set himself free for higher dreams and for greater privileges. This greater privilege is the struggle for our collective freedom, for our collective humanity, for our collective dignity. Du Bois warned us that the great tragedy of our time for undocumented families, for this nation and the world, is not poverty, wickedness, or ignorance, but that humans know so little of other humans.
In the next pages, we invite you to learn about our journey through the darkness as we search for light after the eclipse of dreams, to learn through our stories of struggle and fear, of living illegal, and a little more about what it means to be human, to discover dignity and what it might mean to shed light on a global humanity.
I had never heard us read out loud. So this is kind of a treat for me to hear each other's voices in the spoken word, not just the written word. Um, I want to just also let everybody know who's joining us that you'll have a chance to chime into our conversation in a little while. I will let you know, and also to let you know as well that our book is available for sale. It did launch today, so you can go to the AK Press website and find it. We find ourselves in a unique, or maybe not so unique, current moment that we're sharing with the entire world, and that has driven us in part not to be able to share this moment physically. And so I thought that maybe we can reflect a little bit on what the book has to offer to this moment by maybe sharing a passage that speaks to you, and it speaks to what we're all feeling right now in this moment during this pandemic. Do you want to start? I think we decided maybe Pedro would start.
Yeah, I'll start, and I'm reading off page 124, and there's a poem that my brother wrote, Seferino Santiago Martinez, and the poem is really not untitled, but it's related to where we're from. And this poem, he wrote it in a camp that Steve and I led a few years ago. So I'm going to read it. And then I'm also going to read from page 130 of the book. And the reason why I'm choosing to read the poem, and we're at page 130, the poem, because it provides a perspective of Sef's perspective of how life was as he remembered it when he left our town. And then I'm reading page 130 because I think it provides a experience that challenges the narrative about the US, like providing opportunity, especially in regards to freedom. So I'm going to read a poem now. I am from the field, from ashes and wildlife, the taste burned toast, the sound of the front house, from nature and union, behind yoke and plow, from bulls, horses, weavers, reavers, and the light of day. I am a farmer, from corn, beans, and wheat. I live as the sun rises and sets each day, the never-ending cycle of work, work, work. Days that melt into each other, no day unlike yesterday or tomorrow. I find solace under the mango tree, responsibility of a farmer's life. Even as a student, my days working until I arrive at home, where we speak Zapotec, not Spanish. Our community is close as family, one big circle. If one is ill, no one is ever alone. A favor given, it is never demanded back. It is given por su propia voluntad. The birth of a new child brings the community together to share food to the newborn, celebrating as community, united as family. The search for human dignity and freedom. My younger brother Sefa took a very different path than all of us. He came to the US after me at an even younger age. Just to give perspective, I came here when I was 14. He had the same opportunity to graduate from a high school in the US, but upon graduation, he believed that further education would not make him happy. He had the opportunity to become a dreamer, but he responded to all the encouragement to go to college by saying there was no need to. He didn't believe in any of the America's good intention and or promises. He didn't want to do anything to change his status because he saw it as hopeless. He said he was content and just wanted to live a simple life. No one could convince him to go to college. His goals were simple. He just wanted to make a little money and then return to Mexico to work as a farmer in our village. 1 year after finishing high school, Sefa decided to go back to a village in Oaxaca because he didn't see a life here, at least one with work that does not destroy one's humanity. He saw how hard my brothers worked for minimum wage while being mistreated and exploited. But upon his return, he found that life in Oaxaca was not as he idealized. He left as a child 6 years earlier. The community was not as close as he remembered in his poem. People returned from the US to build fancier homes where they now lived a different lifestyle and kept more to themselves. And while he loved the hard work of working on the land, his money soon ran out, and he could not make a living as a farmer as he had hoped. He was forced once again to leave the village to look for work in Puebla. He was reminded of the suffering that he could not escape on either side of the border. He decided to attempt to cross the desert once again into the US, but was caught by Border Patrol and returned. It was at this time that I contacted him to tell him about the Dream 9 border action in the summer of 2013, led by the National Immigrant Youth Alliance. 3 US Dream Act eligible youth agreed to self-deport to Mexico in order to cross back to the US with 6 other Dream Act eligible youth who left the US briefly but had encountered difficulties and wanted to return. Safe was one of them. Safe didn't join the action to change anything or fix America, or as he says, to be a hero, to become a hero. He supported the messaging of the action, but at the same time, he didn't think it would do anything. He really just wanted to return to the US. He agreed with the other participants that the America's political system, and in particular, the politicians advocating for comprehensive immigration reform, CIR, had failed the immigrant community. So Cefe joined 8 other undocumented youth from Mexico who had lived much of their lives in the US to walk through the Nogales border checkpoint to confront and challenge President Obama's administration's record of mass deportation, including many low priority migrants and dreamers. Cefe's life provides a way for me to see things differently. First, he has helped me see activism and civil disobedience from another perspective. I still think that what he and the others accomplished with the Dream 9 action was important to push against CIR compromises for the few, to fight for the dignity of the larger migrant community. But he reminds me, through the way he lives his life, that on every other ordinary day living in the US as an undocumented person, he is an activist in the struggle to work and to live with dignity.
Thank you, Pedro. Steve, before you share the passage that spoke to you at this moment, can you tell us a little bit about the background that everybody's seeing behind us, behind you and me?
Yeah, this was, there's a non-color version of this in our book that you will find, but this is a painting that was a collaboration that Marco Saavedra, one of our co-authors, and I did together. We intentionally wanted to take these photographs, which are often being used to, as Pedro described in his story, show the dreamer as the hero. But as we were, Marco and I, this is later on in the, I think this is maybe from 2013 that we did this collaboration. The image is actually of early March 2011 after the failed DREAM Act, and it was the first civil disobedience with the break off from United We Dream of a group of undocumented youth that called themselves the National Immigrant Youth Alliance here in Atlanta, and they did this civil disobedience. But the painting, or these are prints that Marco did, and they're of family members, but largely of a mother in the forefront to show that the direct actions and civil disobedience that mothers and fathers have done to get their children who are described as dreamers here are just as important, in fact, maybe more important for grounding all the work of the movement work that was doing and is still continuing to be done.
Steve, you want to share with us a passage that spoke to you from the book?
Yeah, I didn't think very long about what I wanted to share because actually on Facebook, I got a message, you know how it does with memories 2 days ago, reminding me that 7 years ago, 2 days ago, from 7 years from that day, was when we were in the middle of an action that Claudia Nuñez, one of our co-authors, was a part of with the National Immigrant Youth Alliance, when she voluntarily put herself in a position to be able to infiltrate a prison up in Michigan, the Calhoun County, Michigan jail, with the support of the National Immigrant Youth Alliance. And on 2 days ago, my post read, what I've learned from Claudia Nuñez's stories gained through infiltration of Calhoun County Jail in Michigan. And then a quote by Michel Foucault that says, "The prison begins well before its doors. It begins as soon as you leave your house." And the reading comes from a chapter entitled Layers of Pain, chapter 4 in the book, that tells much of Claudia's story and what she experienced there. And the Layers of Pain chapter title really is a theme that is woven throughout the whole book, and is a major theme in all of our chapters and all the chapters that we are telling together. I think this also speaks to what we're dealing with the coronavirus now, when we get to that question maybe later as well. And let me just read 2 paragraphs from that. Speaking from Claudia's voice. "I cannot look at my photos of my mother on social media because I break down. My chest literally feels heavy and tears start flowing down my face, no matter how much I try to stop them. And every time I find myself saying, 'You have to be strong. This is the price you pay. You are born in a fragmented way, therefore your heart will be forever split.' But this doesn't help. I see my mom's face, now in her mid-70s, a face that I mainly see through photos because when I left her side, she was in her late 50s. My mother, so beautiful, the light of my life, now looks much older. I can see things on her face I hadn't seen before I left, and I ask questions I never asked before. How many layers of pain does she have in her soul, I wonder? My mother, who could only attend school up until the 1st grade, whose father abandoned her when she got very ill as a baby, who grew up so financially poor that she didn't wear shoes until she was 6 or 7 years of age, whose mother went to the city and married an abusive man who could at least afford shoes for her younger children, who learned how to read and write in her 40s when I started going to school, who raised 9 children on the salary of a man who for many years drank almost as much as he worked. My mother, how many layers tell your story? How many layers tell mine? I have to say that up until I sat in that cold jail cell in Michigan, almost in complete darkness, that I had spent so little time pondering these so-called layers of pain or stages of trauma. I knew before then that people go through many issues and problems throughout life, but it was hard for me to think of these issues as trauma on top of trauma, because it seems that often there's just one traumatic event that overpowers them all. As a community, we've done a poor job at seeing people, especially women, as multidimensional. I mostly embraced the idea of trauma being linear or one-dimensional because when I joined the immigrant rights movement in 2001, there was a notion within immigrant groups that the biggest problem undocumented people had was in fact just being undocumented. For instance, in various groups, when we share our stories, nearly all of them focused on the trauma of being illegal had on our lives. So it was encouraged and almost suggested that our narratives focus on that. There were times when people mentioned poverty or violence in sharing groups, but in the early days of the Dreamer movement around 2001 or 2002, poverty and violence were talked about as something you left behind in your home country and not something that one had to talk about in America. This, of course, is a lie. Because abuse and violence against marginalized women of color in American history is as old as America itself. I later realized that this perpetual silence regarding abuse and violence against women of color existed because in many ways, the population most targeted by abuse and violence in America is Black and Indigenous women. And as I evolved and disengaged from the larger immigrant rights movement, I realized further that the movement was largely equating the American dream with whiteness. For many of the organizations and people involved, any suffering and pain of immigrant women of color that was not directly related to immigration status seemed just inconvenient. So I chose this passage because of this layers of pain. I feels like I already said is throughout our book, and what the layers of pain speaks to me, not just in this moment, but describing the moments we talk about in the journey, is that we do not have an immigration problem or a poverty problem or a lack of healthcare problem. And what we learn from Claudia and these stories is that there are no single issue problems, that they're all connected and they're much more complex. And that in the work that we do, especially, and maybe our book is a criticism of a lot of liberal organizing that treats problems as these single issues in terms of both its analysis of what's wrong, but also in terms of how to fix it. And so the fix is always some simple piece of legislation or some piece of law that will help one siloed group of people. And what we learned from Claudia and the women she met, largely from Guatemala in that prison, it was that their pain was layered. And then when one begins looking at these layers of pain and their complexity, one begins seeing how deep they go. And if we really are to get at the root of these problems in terms of our analysis of what's wrong, but how to fix it, we have to get down to the structure of American society. And the white settler colonial problem of empire that we have, which we call in this the American dream, and wake up that to the fact that the American dream is truly a lie. It isn't an illusion. And this is much of what the Poor People's Campaign now that is doing at its best when it does its storytelling, is reminding us what King had done, and probably what got him killed 50 years ago, was his move away from the fight for civil rights and the fight for humanity, and was looking for more than just a simple piece of legislation to fix the problems for Black people, but was seeing that Black people's problems were connected to all people's problems, and that were actually global, and that described this society that we needed to, this American dream, as the problem of racism and militarism and materialism. And the hope out of doing this, that sounds all negative. I think what I get from Claudia in this story and what we've done in our group writing is that in going down and deeply, and especially through sharing of suffering, this is our way forward. And this is the hope that we can get, is that we find solidarity with others as we begin connecting each other's stories and seeing how suffering is shared and how deeply we are all alienated from ourselves and from each other.
I was going to read originally an excerpt from the chapter on the miseducation of a migrant that spoke to kind of one of the themes of our stories, which is this unlearning that's been happening, right? That we have done ourselves and we have done collectively. But instead, after talking to Fidel today, he's at work, and for that reason, he was not able to join us. And he asked me to share instead what he first wrote. And that's shared in chapter 3, the Porter Dreamer story. He was a student in my class many years ago, and he was detained while he was in class. And so I wanted to share part of that story with you today because Fidel cannot share it himself, but also because it reflects something of our current moment, which is that deportations are still happening, that there are people suffering in our detention centers, and that are detainees all over the country who are now an invisible population and a disposable population, especially in this current pandemic. So I'm gonna share part of a deported dreamer story starting on page 94. I was transferred to the county jail a few miles north. The state of Texas requires a social security number to issue a valid driver's license. Because I do not have a valid social security card, ICE put a hold on me. This meant that I would be released to ICE. Eventually, when I was released from jail, I was taken by ICE to their office in Dallas, where ICE enters into the system all those individuals like me who are here in the country undocumented. The feelings I felt there were frightening, at least they were to me. In a room where I was kept, which can be compared to one room of a 2-bedroom apartment, held at least 25 individuals who also had to share one bathroom while the rest of the detainees went on with their conversations. There, I heard conversations I had not heard before. Perhaps a moment in which we are marked, our personhood stamped as an entity, is transformative because it is a moment when life as we know it ends. If we are lucky, it is put on pause. We realize that we're no longer who we thought we were, and that the reality we envisioned for ourselves was just a dream. We hope for something bigger. We think of what it was, and we see ourselves with no future. Each person was called by their name, entered into a system, and given the chance to make one phone call. I called my brother. Once your name has been called and you were in the system, you were ready to be sent back. I felt horrible making that phone call because it was in that moment that I knew there was absolutely no possibility that I could remain in the country. I had just signed my voluntary departure. For a system that sees a criminal, it is their version of admission of guilt. For someone who has lost their humanity, it is the point at which the image of the self as it once was collides with the image of the criminal. I was in tears and I couldn't even speak a sentence. Soon I had to hang up because my time was up. The process of deportation is incredibly painful in every sense of the word. Although I feel I didn't commit a crime, I was treated as though I was a dangerous criminal. I was literally chained from head to toe. I didn't know what waited for me in Mexico, but I knew I was on my way to find out. By now, it had been years since I lived in Mexico, so it all seemed strange to me. Though I have my grandparents, my sister, and other siblings, my closest family all reside in the United States. And despite the US's effort to send me home, I knew I was leaving home. The plane arrived mid-afternoon in El Paso, while all deportees were to be released across the border into Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. I didn't know what to do. I mean, what do you do in a city that has been plagued by so much violence that the minute you get there, the first thing you hear is advice not to get into just any taxi because you might be kidnapped? And it speaks to me at various levels, in part because also it reflects what is happening right now and continues to happen. And it also reflects a moment of unlearning for me, where as an educator, as a professor, as somebody who believes that somehow educational is transformational, and that especially higher education is the key for equal opportunity, I saw the destructive nature of education, right? It was sort of education that put unnamed dreamer in the point of dangers, because he had to get in his car to drive to school, to do all of the things that were expected of him. And so I had to learn that education, that school, that the systems that were supposed to protect us are systems that maybe are actually put us all in the greatest of danger. And so it was really living through this process of trying to get help from the university, from the institutions that were there supposed to provide support, that I really unlocked the nightmare, if you will. And that, of course, a nightmare that Fidel was feeling in his own flesh and blood. So the last thing that I want us to discuss, I think we all have experienced this moment in various ways. And for me, I sing. And so I've been singing in my head since the time of the pandemic sort of exploded in our nation, this song by Soledad Bravo, who is actually a Venezuelan artist. And so there's a song by Silvio Rodriguez, La era está pariendo un corazón, our era is birthing a heart, that really I just been singing and singing in my head. And part of it is because of the way that Soledad sings this song. Is just this very grounding voice. But also it's because of the theme of the song. I feel like we're in a moment of struggle, like the moments that we describe in the book, where we're at a crossroads and we're birthing something, right? And so I'm wondering if you can, if we can talk collectively about how the book and the stories that we shared in the book have prepared us all for this moment of where we are at the crossroads and trying to perhaps birth something new. Steve, you want to start, or Pedro?
I can start then. I hear you asking that question about this moment of collective pain and birth, and particularly in light of what we're experiencing right now, not just in this nation, but across the whole world with the pandemic of the coronavirus. Is that what that's how I'm hearing your question?
Yes.
How does this book and our experiences in writing this book together and what we've taken from that and learned from that prepare us for this moment that we're living in right now, the times that we're living in now? My first thoughts come really out of the chapter that I shared, Layers of Pain, which is throughout our whole book, which I think in many ways, the people that we are speaking, as we speak to each other, and the people that we're speaking to, this does come as a harsh shock to us, but maybe not in the way that it does to folks that are not accustomed to pain and suffering, and or at least talking about it, acknowledging that. That's one thing. But the second is, I think, and particularly through my work with the Poor People's Campaign and my opportunity to travel the country before the virus and hear testifiers testifying and sharing and bearing witness to their pain, but also the power that they have in local communities. And that continued since digitally now, since the virus has come. But hearing from them that just like with Claudia and what you're saying, this coronavirus, as it hits people, is just one top layer of many other layers of pain. And what we're seeing right now, especially among the vulnerable and the poor and the oppressed, the 140 million we're considered poor in our country, is that that they are hit in ways more deeply than others. That when you don't have access to healthcare, when you are already barely able to afford rent, when your job is tied to be an essential worker, and then you're called a hero, but you really have no choice but to go to work, or you are in that basic wage job and you've lost it and you're at home and don't know how you're going to pay. There's all these layers of pain then are stacking up on top of each other in ways that some of us, many of us that benefit from this American dream, the very few of us, the corporate elite, the wealthy in the world, are not experiencing this pandemic in the way we're experiencing it. So for me, I think what our book shares would share is that we need to look beyond just the pandemic of the coronavirus and looking for simple things like a vaccine, but rather to see that in this moment there's a pandemic of capitalism and nationalism, nation states in collaboration around the world in this corporate system, corporate-led dominated world system that is a pandemic and has been a pandemic for a much longer time. And as we begin listening to stories of people who are suffering from the coronavirus and we go deeper, we begin to see that the solution and the way forward, if we listen to the poor and we listen to the oppressed and listen to those who are suffering, that we need more than just simple vaccines, and we need more than simply getting on with the economy right now, that the economy is not going to be is not going to be our savior, as we are being told right now in this moment. That's some of my gut feelings right now.
Pedro, you want to chime in?
I think for me, it's like I was actually just talking about education with my coworker. I'm lucky to be able to work from home and not have to go out and really risk being exposed to COVID-19. But it's also like, and also talking to different people who don't have jobs, don't have how to make ends meet that during this time. It just, and also talking to family who are living in Mexico, so this is not like like Steve said, this is a worldwide issue that we have to confront, and by listening to the people who are on the grounds and experiencing this, we're able to learn a lot from that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one lesson from our book and one way that our book speaks to this moment is that, you know, we talk about the undocumented-led struggle for freedom, right? And it was our collective journeys and their journeys by facing pain and fear head on in the multiple ways in which everybody experienced those that have prepared us for this moment. I mean, I think if we're unable to see ourselves in the mirror right now and see somebody else, right, then we expect that then we will either have a vaccine and solve everything, or that we can continue to return to normalcy, right? And I think one thing that we can take from this book is that we can never return to what it was, ever, because what it was it's a lie, right? And so for those of us who can work from home, who have that privilege, for those of us who have secure jobs, for those of us in education that hear the struggles of our students and their families, we have the opportunity then to take their lead, right? And to be able to push that forward, to forge a new path, and forge something different. We talk a little bit about accompaniment and acompañamiento, and I think this is a perfect opportunity to do that, to accompany each other and to accompany those who are struggling with those multiple layers of pain at this moment. Anything else you two want to add, Pedro and Steve, before we open it up for questions? I see we have one question in the Q&A.
I don't have anything else.
Okay, so
how do we see it? Are there more questions? How do we gonna see people asking questions?
Well, if we click on that Q&A box, then we can see questions. And then if others of you have questions, please start sending those questions on the Q&A. So this is a question that was sent in by Charles. Given the limited value of legislative answers to questions of dignity and freedom, how do you envision the path forward, and what and where is the struggle? I think we partly started talking to that. I think what and where is a struggle is that it's everywhere and that there are multiple struggles. Do you see the questions, Pedro and Steve?
Yeah, I see it now.
Yeah.
You want to add a little bit to that?
I remember, well, it's like almost 20 years ago in Hong Kong, when Emmanuel Wallerstein had come to visit. I was a researcher there, and he was talking a lot about the things we were talking about, and the death throes or the collapse of capitalism that might be on the horizon, and especially in Hong Kong of all places, considered a neoliberal paradise. You can imagine students were questioning him, doubting him. But I remember one student asking, well, if that's true, then what's next? And he didn't have an answer. He said, I don't know what's next. It's up to us to see what's next. And I don't think that's an easy way out of this. But I think when we start looking, when we hear what he was trying to say and what we're trying to say in our book, is that the struggle looks very different than a struggle for one particular group of people's rights to exist in this system we call America, or this world global system that is in place right now. That the fight for freedom, because the fight for freedom brings about human dignity and humanizes all of us, and in ways that rights do not. Doesn't mean that there isn't another kind of human rights framework we could talk about, but I think that efforts for rights, when they're narrow and usually tied to some piece of legislation, are not going to bring about human dignity and the humanizing of one another. And what that is going to look like is going to be a radical restructuring of the social, political, and economic relations with one another. Which might take legislation, but not a piece of it. Maybe large-scale legislation that begins to limit the rights of corporations, and puts human individuals, and the human community as more value than corporations. Whole piece legislation that will do things that will guarantee the right to move wherever you want in the world, the right to have a living wage, the right to health care. These are the kinds of things that a movement that I think that we want to be a part of, or is coming, will be asking for those kinds of things. And I have a sense that it's going to come from the global South. It's going to be indigenous-led people. I guess with the coronavirus and the way things are right now, it could come from here within the United States, as we see amongst the Poor People's Campaign, when people began organizing with one another who are among the poor and have had these experiences and know what is truly wrong. These are the people that working together have the answers for the world we need to move into and live into, and the solutions we need, which will not come from a political candidate or a simple piece of legislation, would be my answer.
Mm-hmm. Pedro, you want to add something?
I don't even know what to add, because there's so much that needs to take place before we can even, I mean, just even thinking about the stimulus package that was given to families, that there's, even with families with mixed statuses, we're not able to receive anything being U.S. citizen, right? That shouldn't even happen in my mind, that if everybody should be able to get support when, especially during times of crisis, and they didn't. So
yeah, and maybe to add to that, right, from the perspective of an anthropologist and an academic, I would say that what and where the struggle is where we're at right now, right? And so usually as academics and anthropologists, we tend to see the struggle somewhere else. And we observe it, but we don't, we describe it, we don't participate in it, and we don't attempt to change it. And so I think we also have a responsibility to look inward, and the same thing inward in our social movements as well, right? Sometimes we're engaging in practices that replicate some of the things that we're calling out or struggling against. We have also a question from Benito, who asks, could you speak a little to the process of how this book came together, and when did it become evident that you wanted to publish something collaboratively? Thank you for asking that. Pedro, you want to take a stab at it?
Well, Steve and I have been wanting to publish alongside with Maria Karen, one of our friends here in Lexington, a long time ago, about our experiences here in Lexington and across the U.S. really, but we've not been able to do that until with AK Press. So it's really been. It came out of friendship and wanting to share our experiences and what we've seen with others. And it has taken a really long time. I don't remember what year that was. Do you remember what year that was, Steve, that we tried to publish something?
Steve, you're muted.
You and I first started writing things together in 2012 or 11, I think. And then us as a group, was it 2014 or
2013 or 2014?
13?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I remember, I think in conversations I had with all of you and our other co-authors as well, it's kind of this a collective experience of frustration that the books and articles that had come out or were coming out. And I remember even submitting articles with you, some of you, to like, I'll go ahead and call it out, Latino Studies Journal. We were rejected by other academic scholars in it, saying that that what we were describing didn't exist because they were so in bed with or like following everything so deeply from just United We Dream narrative and the liberal democratic establishment, the liberal Democrats, and we're not attuned to these other realities that were happening and other movements of people that were not funded well, did not have the supports always of the Democrats, and we're calling for things for more than just simple pieces of legislation. We're actually calling for calling for this, for dignity for aunts and uncles and mothers and fathers who are facing deportation, and threats in workplaces that were not being addressed by the political establishment. And for us, I think right from the beginning, we didn't want this storytelling to be from one individual. And even that's why it's taken this long, I think too, is like it's very hard to write collectively. And we wanted this collective voice to come out as actually kind of an example of the world we want to live into, is the movement away from our own egos, our own individualized world, place in the world, and to see ourselves as collective solutions and the way we do collect authorship, and it took collective listening. All of these things take so much longer, but I think they're part of, like, we wanted to put into practice the very world we wanted to live into, and that meant doing this collectively for me.
Mm-hmm. And also it meant embracing our expertise and certain kinds of privileges that we have. And so we didn't sit at the table and write all of it together, right? Some of us took responsibility for other parts, and Steve and I were shepherded with negotiating a lot of the actual putting together of all the stories and publishing the book and scheduling stuff, doing all of that kind of work, because we have the time and we have the knowledge and opportunity to do that. So collectively also meant taking responsibility for what we can offer and when we could offer it as well. And a lot of us sort of, I mean, I remember meeting you, Steve, through a former student that was an activist in Houston, and just mentioned your name. And I think I looked you up at a conference, an anthropology conference. It's like, I gotta meet Steve because this former student who's an activist in Houston is telling me that I need to meet him. And so a lot of I think the connections sort of came from other connections. And then just kind of building those and cultivating those, I think is part of what the process of putting this book together entailed for us. So also, let's see, Charles from YouTube sent a question. Being that many essential workers in this pandemic are high risk undocumented workers, what are your thoughts on the need for modern day syndicalist unions? Yay, that's my thought. Yes.
We just experienced May Day, so yes. We could sing the old songs of the importance of unions, maybe the old school ones, and maybe not as much. A modern day one would have to be different than a lot of the modern day ones.
Yeah, I mean, and it's people at the local level, grassroots organizations and individuals that are advocating for those undocumented workers that are really at the front lines and who are not benefiting, like Pedro described, from either the federal government, the local government, and either nonprofit organizations. Here where I am locally in Texas, even the funds that have been released by the city to local nonprofits to help with housing and food and rent assistance exclude the undocumented. And there's no information that is offered bilingually, right? And so they're a completely invisible population. And so local communities that are having to advocate and raise funds locally to be able to support those workers that are in our front lines. Pedro, you want to add to that?
I don't have anything else to add to that. I mean, it's really hard for folks who are undocumented right now. I mean, especially right now when they don't have where to get support. But not just here either, like other parts of the world where people don't have a safety net or any other means of really how to meet their ends meet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Bridget also shared a question. Please share where you find strength and encouragement. I think part of what brings people together to move toward common freedom is sharing and hearing pain, but also sources of encouragement and strength. For instance, I just happened to use this passage for meditation today. Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Isaiah 43.
I think for me is just keep learning from other folks who really struggle all the time, even my own family members. But even just remembering, trying to think back of how life used to be and like the journey of coming from what used to be my home to a new place that has really becoming my second home. So but can't really be in one place. And so really finding strength in figuring out how to make homes in different places where I go, and those people who I meet there, they are the ones who encourage me, who gives me strength. And so that's where I find my strength, at least in trying to deal with things in the grand scheme of things.
For me, in addition to like songs from the past of the Nueva Trova Cubana and whatnot, food. And I think, so I baked this cake, torta de piña, pineapple upside down cake that my aunt used to bake in Venezuela. And it's just the flavors and the sounds and just the embodiment of home and safety, that has been a way for me to find strength. And it's something that I learned to appreciate in part and to cultivate through the testimonials that are shared in the book. There's home is everywhere. And so the ways in which we find home and the ways in which we recreate that feeling of safety, and pleasure and enjoyment, I think it's a lesson for me. And so getting myself rooted, it's where I find encouragement.
For me, it might sound trite, but it isn't. It's very deep, and I find my hope and encouragement when I'm able to recognize and pay attention to love that is in my life and love around me, from my co-authors here, the people I meet in community. I remember Pedro. I don't know why these memories are all coming back as we're here on this, but going back, 10 years ago when I met you, maybe for the first time, and early on, I was not Profe, I was Tio or Uncle, Tio Stevo. It's kind of embarrassing. I used to laugh and it was embarrassed. You all would call me that, but there's a profound sense of encouragement that one gets out of that when one recognizes that we're all part of the same family. And you love me and I love you. And that buoys us up, that holds us together when we go through our collective suffering together. And I always find hope in the most despairing situations, because I find love there. I always find love in some way, and I connect with other humans that love me and show me what love looks like. And that will probably continue to be my source of encouragement for a long time.
We have another question. There looks like two more questions. So first from Will. Hi, Will. Good to see you online. Thank you so much for adapting to this space and sharing this very powerful and profound work. My question is, in this time of not knowing how long the pandemic will last, 6, 18, 12 months longer, before an accessible enough vaccine reaches its arms around the world, what are the very qualities of the poor and marginalized, endurance, grace, family fortitude, do you assume will rise amidst those of affluence and in the media merely focus on their own privilege, loss, and how trillions of dollars of relief will never be enough, a reality few of us can actually empathize with? And Will writes, I know that may not make sense, but I hope you can at least capture the essence. I think what you're asking is, what are the qualities, maybe what are the qualities of the oppressed that will be appropriated? Is that what you're asking, Will? Or maybe what are the qualities that they can teach us that can get us through the pandemic? What are the qualities that they can teach us? Yes.
Well, from my answer to, I mean, there's a lot in that question. I'm going back and seeing it, but the thing that I immediately first was connecting to, this is like, what are the qualities among the poor and marginalized you assume will rise? And for me, it's a way, it's not, we can't idealize the poor and the marginalized, whoever they may be. But amongst many who are oppressed, what they've taught me through accompaniment is another way to see, that helps me see in the world. I remember one of my I've taken as one of my job just descriptions in the world, that of witness and telling the truth about the lies I've told myself and the illusions that I operate under. And I take that from a time when James Baldwin, who was very upset and frustrated with a group of white liberals, they were asking and pushing, "What do you want from us?" And that's what his answer was. "You know exactly what I want from you. Just begin telling the truth about the lies you tell yourself and the illusions you live under." And I think amongst the poor in particular is that they see very clearly that the lies that we tell ourselves and the illusions that we're living under in terms of what freedom looks like and how to move forward. And so I think from my answer to yours is just a way of seeing that we can learn from the poor and the marginalized, that would help us get at seeing the lies, particularly in our book, of this American dream.
In sort of the Latin American literature, right, there's this idea of the buen vivir, right, of living the good life. And it's not the good life of capitalism, of, getting your hair cut or having a meal in a restaurant with hundreds of people. Is a life that's rooted in connection with the environment, in connection with your past and your present. Maybe for us, in stereotypical Latin American ideas of Latinos, right? Maybe familia, but that idea of the connection and what Steve was referring to, loving one another. And so I think this notion of simplicity, of what really matters, that we can see through the eyes of those who are the most vulnerable. Pedro, want to add?
So it's hard to follow both of you with that, because I think you both really covered what we could potentially see come out from listening to the poor, to people who have so little, but yet I feel like have the most to offer by listening to them.
And Paulo Suarez also sent a question: where do you situate your book within the growing literature on undocumented migrants and immigration? Steve mentioned that some journals rejected this work because it did not exist. How do you see the theoretical landscape on migration and illegality shaping up in our current moment? I hope you can speak of the theoretical landscape in each of your fields and beyond, if you wish: anthropology, activism, art, etc. Do you want to add, Pedro?
Well, I think what we're trying to share through this book, or at least the message, is that we live in a very complex world that I think this book can be placed in any field, because it talks, the message is more about how maybe a way to move forward, but without really, by listening to folks. And I think anthropologists do that, activism does that sometimes, and this activism that is rooted in listening ground roots, I guess. I think people could use this in multiple ways.
I'm thinking too, in anthropology is a theoretical question related to methodology and voice, right? So how do you work with, right, and write with in ways that are non-hierarchical and that are democratic? And how do you create spaces in terms of ideas, but also in terms of communicating that are not always led and dictated by the academic as the person that has all of the expertise and all of the knowledge and all of the tools. So I guess, you know, part of the challenging of situating this book, like Pedro was talking about, is that it speaks to many, many fields simultaneously. And so in publishing the book originally, you know, we have all these amazing photographs and poems and other pieces of art plus prose, right? And so we were limited in the outlet because academic presses, you know, cannot deal with that complexity of vocabulary in one single text. And so that was a challenge. We wanted to be able to use those various tongues and to use those various sources of expertise and of telling stories and of connecting with one another and also with an audience in one single space. Steve, you want to add?
No, I think you both are describing things that I was sensing. Maybe I would just add that my comment about what was happening in the literature goes back to 2012, 8 years ago. And I think what you just described, we are seeing a good things happening. And from my perspective, in terms of the evolution of writing about immigration and legality, in part because many of the things you've just said, that more people who have been undocumented or who've had this migration experience are the subject that are speaking to this. And there's since then we've had the Black Lives Matter movement and other kinds of movements like that that not only shape academic literature but actually the political landscape and lets it be more complex. So we have Mi Gente now. We didn't have Mi Gente then. A group of many of the people that we've written about in our or people participated in our book have helped form that. So that they can analyze the political landscape and describe what's happening in terms of legality, illegality, and migration or immigration in ways that we weren't talking about 10 years ago, that sees the complexity behind that are not looking for one political candidate to solve all their problems, but are looking at ways of organizing in very deep, sophisticated ways that really describe the human experience and how we need to move forward. I see that both in the literature and in the organizing.
Mm-hmm. Welcome, Paulo. I don't see any other questions. So I think we're close to our time. Pedro and Steve, you want to share something in closing?
I think I just wanted to add that these stories, a lot of these stories come from like darkness, also from love, from just different experiences that we all have had, and throughout the friendships and relationships that we built with one another that made this book possible. And hopefully everybody gets to check it out.
And I would just add just to share heartfelt gratitude for each of my co-authors, and those aren't present, just again, to call into this space, Marco and Fidel and Claudia, who are not with us here in this, who are a very important part of my heart space and our book space, who weren't present, and want to be grateful and thank you for all of you.
Yes, same here. Just privileged to be able to be sharing space with all of you, those of you who have joined us to hear you, and of course hear us, and of course Steve and Pedro, and yes, and Claudia and Marco and Fidel. We appreciate you joining us and asking questions and listening to us. And thanks to AK Press for giving us the opportunity to share our work. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon, early evening for some of you. Take care of yourselves. Thanks so much.